Good day. Welcome to another Ransom's Weekly Wraps. I'm Bob Govender, and as usual, what we'll do is we'll go over some stories that affect you and your investments going forward and do a little AI/tech segment at the end. Our three stories this week are going to be the rand, the budget speech, and the Japanese yen. And then in our AI segment, we'll look at the latest executive order from the Biden administration around AI. So let's start off with the local news. Firstly, the Japanese yen. The Japanese yen has breached 150 for yet another time. This is significant because what it indicates is that the Central Bank of Japan is having difficulty maintaining, control of the value of the currency, which is the most important value attribute of a central bank, is to protect the value of a currency. That's the number one rule a central bank needs to have. And why is that the case? Well, I think Japan is an indicative, example of what the future looks like for much of the world. Why? So what happened was Japan at one point in time, in the 1980s and so on, was the most, it was like what China was before China, where all the interesting stuff was happening, and in fact they were growing, to a higher level than China was. It was a smaller country, but in terms of the impact that they were having in the world was quite huge. You look back in the 1980s movies and stuff, you find a lot of stuff around the rise of Japan, and that same kind of stuff you see around China right now, that was in Japan. And China, I think, is slowing down before Japan slowed down. Because China is slowing down at a rate when they're not rich. Japan kind of slowed down when they were very rich. But what happened was in Japan around like the early 1990s, that economy kind of like stagnated. And it has been that kind of situation for like the last 30 years or so. And the real reason that's been happening is because the demographics have just been terrible. They just have a declining working age population and a huge growing elderly population. Now, any country in the world, in the first world anyway, has obligations that it basically has to its elderly citizens. So what they do generally is give them pensions and healthcare, and they take care of them and so on. And this is like guaranteed. And it's very difficult to get rid of that obligation because the elderly tend to vote. And if you have a democracy and people don't like you, they don't vote for you, you don't stay in power. So yeah, the elderly vote, and the elderly keep people in power that will make sure the elderly are taken care of. Japan is no different. At the same time, that because of the demographics happening, because they didn't have enough children, what happened was there's a smaller working age populations. Normally you have people work, pay taxes, the taxes are used to pay for stuff. Now you have a situation where there's not enough people working to pay the taxes, but you have a lot of stuff to pay for. What do? You don't earn enough, you have to spend more money, you borrow. And Japan has been borrowing a lot of money over the last several decades, to a point at which they are by far the most indebted in terms of percentage of GDP of the large economies of the world. That has happened to Japan, I think, as a first step, as first basically, before anybody else. But it's not something that's not going to be followed by other people as well. Europe is aging drastically. You're looking at declining populations across the whole of Europe. Places like Germany, really terrible situation. Italy as well. France is not quite as bad, but still not great. The US is looking a little bit better because the US imports a lot of immigrants, a lot more immigrants than many parts of the world. But still, they are also facing issues because the biggest generation, the boomer generation, baby boomers, are retiring right now. And they are taking a huge amount of, firstly, skilled labor off the market, and then adding a huge amount of burden to the U.S. social network, social welfare network. Okay, and that is, I think, a huge issue that we're going to be seeing around the world. And why is that important? Is because look what's happening in Japan right now. They have a debt that's so large that they can't afford to raise interest rates. They kind of lost control of the interest rate policy because the debt is so large. If they raised interest rates, they would have to pay more interest on that debt. That's how it works. Higher interest rates, higher interest payments. It's like having a house, and if you can afford it at a 1% interest rate, but you can't afford it at a 10% interest rate. The same thing with Japan. They can afford their debt at maybe under 1%, but they can't afford that debt if it's more than 1%. And so they have basically a rule in place right now where they kind of have a line in the sand where they do not allow interest rates to go above 1%. And that's been something they've been holding on to for quite some time. Despite the fact that inflation has started to tick up in Japan, despite the fact that they are seeing a situation where the currency is weakening, they can't afford for interest rates to rise because they can't afford to pay that debt. And that'll be a situation that we'll be seeing elsewhere in the world, so just watch out for that. Next, the rand. The rand is stronger right now, below 1850 to the US dollar as I speak to you. And why is it important? Well, Firstly, the rand has basically not been at this level for a little while. It's been mostly between about 1870 to about 1930, maybe even a little higher than 1930. Now 1850, maybe there's a new trend breaking through. But generally, there's a kind of a trend that you tend to find at the end of the year in South Africa, that we tend to strengthen in terms of our currency near the end of the year. And there's some explanations around that. Some people say it's because of the fact that the retail stores stop importing as much around this time. They bought stuff for Christmas, they paid for it. Now the stuff is coming through. They're not going to buy stuff again for January, February as much as they bought for Christmas, and therefore the demand for imports goes down. They don't spend as much rands, they don't import as much stuff. Therefore, the currency doesn't have as much weakness. And near the end of the year, you tend to find that the rand tend to strengthen, historically. So most of the times you look back at the end of the year, you tend to find a bit of a strengthening streak that happens in the currency, and that could be part of it. The next thing I want to point out is that, remember a while back there was that argument. I think people like Magnus Haystack and a couple other people were coming out and talking about, the new changes happening with regards to offshore transfers. It wasn't anything about the limits; it was about more of the administrative stuff behind the scenes. And at the time, people were talking about, hey, is it more difficult? And Magnus was coming out and saying, no, it's actually much more difficult. Blah blah blah. A lot of people are saying, no, this is actually easier, and so on. And it's very difficult to know about these things before they actually are implemented. Now, it's been a few months since then, and I personally can give you some information about how things have looked. And unfortunately, it seems that Magnus Haystack was right. It does seem that we are seeing a situation in which we are looking at the government increasing the administrative burdens in terms of offshore transfers for the amount of money you can transfer above $1 million rands, basically. So for that extra 10 million rand discretionary, you have a million rand that you can do, every year, that resets every year, and you can do up to another 10 million rands beyond that. The other 10 million rands needs things like a tax clearance, etc., to get you through that point. Unfortunately, that the extra 10 million has now become a little more difficult to do, and that kind of makes sense, looking at the way the country looks like at the moment. And I would advise, if you are looking at taking money out of the country right now with a bit of strength, going into December, probably try and use your 1 million rand offshore allowance if you can. It is something I think that is more valuable now than it used to be in the past, because in the past, if you want to take maybe 5 million rands next year out, hey, just get a tax clearance, you get it done. Now, if it's more difficult to get that thing, it's still possible, and we can help you if you want do that. We just have found it slightly more difficult to do it now than it was in the past. If you're not as able to do it 5 million at a time, then that 1 million each year becomes more valuable to you, and you don't want to be wasting it. So if you are the fence about getting some money out of the country this year or not, I would suggest, if you have not used your 1 million allowance, do it this year. Next comes the budget speech. The minister came out and he came with a really dire kind of forecast for the country, saying that austerity is required, etc. He said all the right things, except he didn't do any of the right measures. We have not seen any kind of measure coming through that's going to really make the country basically in a stronger fiscal situation, and it can't come through right now. Why? Because we have an election next year. There's no way any country or any party that wants to basically stay in power and is as borderline as the ANC is right now. I mean, the ANC is somewhere by polling just above 50 to something like 45 in terms of polling. Some people have them as low as 41, 40 even. And the ANC has never been below 50 since we started, true democracy in South Africa. If the ANC was at 75 or 80, I could see them basically pushing austerity through, because they have enough of a buffer to make sure they stay in power. But at 40 to 50%, no, it's not anywhere near strong enough for that. In fact, even without doing this, they may be not staying in power. But what's going to be happening is that we are not going to see any kind of austerity measures that's going to affect them, affect the budget properly. Things that they would need to do is cut entitlements, which I would be very against personally myself. I think that the number one, purpose of a government is to protect the weakest in the country, and the entitlements, despite what you might think about the old age grant or the child welfare grant in South Africa, etc., are necessary and are very, very useful to these people. The people that require the child welfare grant, it makes a real difference in that child's life. The elderly people that get the welfare payment, but the vast majority of them, it makes a real difference in their lives. And I think that it would be a sin to not have that in there. But things you could probably look at is things like, for instance, wage payments for civil servants. Symbolic things like cutting the blue light, budget here for those personal protection of ministers. These things won't be enough, but that could be a step in the right direction. But now to AI segment. The biggest news of the last week or so was the executive order from the Biden administration around restrictions on AI and rules around making it safer. Now, when it comes to AI safety, there's two kinds of rules that people are worried about or concerned about. One is basically, things like discrimination, things like, for instance, prejudice and so on. So, for instance, if you had to put raw data into an AI system, it might come out with, like, for instance, it has happened in the past, recommending higher, jail sentences to black people, for instance, as opposed to white people, or recommending high interest rates, based on race and so on. And there's obviously, had issues around that, and that's one aspect of safety. The other aspect of AI safety is the possibility that AI might kill everybody. And I'm not exaggerating. There is a significant percentage of AI scientists that believe AI could kill everybody. And I'm not talking about, 1 or 2%. We're talking maybe, I think the number is something like half of AI scientists, but at least a 10% chance that AI will kill everybody. And we are talking about the most senior people working in the field. It would be like, for instance, if half of the people working in coal power plants believe that coal power was going to kill everybody. You know what I mean? At least 10% chance they're going to kill everybody. You'll probably never have coal. But then again, there is that possibility out there. And why is this the case? It's because we really don't understand how AI works. And there's the possibility that we create something stronger than we are. And when there's something stronger than you in the environment, you don't tend to do very well. You put humans into an environment where they were nothing as smart and as basically, intelligent as us. Guess what? We run the world. We only run the world because we are the smartest, most intelligent things out there. Make something smarter and more intelligent than us, maybe we don't run the world anymore. That's the issue. And so that is obviously a huge, danger in the world. And so this kind of executive order was meant to address both parts. One part was looking at basically things like, making sure there was no discrimination. There were tests to look at, if any kind of results coming out, if you are using AI for a particular, purpose, that you can demonstrate that it wasn't discriminating based on race and so on. The other part was limiting just how powerful something could be before you basically were getting some kind of government oversight coming in. They talked about things like the amount of data going into it, amount of computer flops and so on, how much computing power you're putting into it, basically. And what's interesting about this is that this is like just the first real big move for the US government. The US government is by far the most important player here, because the EU has come up with stuff in the past, but nobody's really doing the stuff in the European Union. The US is by far the number one leader in the world when it comes to AI, and it's not even close. And so only the US government's rules are probably the rules that are going to apply here, because the EU might have like some sway of places like Google and Facebook, etc. Because if you want to do business in the EU, then you got to basically follow their rules. But if you're not developing, you're only developing stuff and you haven't started doing business with stuff yet, the EU rules don't really affect you. So someone can create something really powerful, something really dangerous, and only when they start encountering the EU customer will the EU basically rules affect them. Whereas with what's happening with the US right now would affect you from the start. And I think that's really interesting. At the moment, I don't really know if this is going to be sufficient, or maybe even overkill in terms of what the rules look like. But that being said, this is the first, like I said, real big move in the US administration around AI safety. And I think this is probably something that has to be looked at going forward. Regulation has to come into play in this sector. It's going to be too powerful and it's going to be developing too fast for this not to happen. Okay, that's it for this week. I look forward to speaking to you guys again next week. Cheers.